No more executions in California. What's next after the governor's moratorium on the death penalty? The largest college admission scam taken on by the Justice Department. Plus, more challenges for the Salton Sea and its changing ecosystem. And a victory for advocates of open government. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, Matt Hall, Editorial and Opinion Director at the San Diego Union Tribune. Union Tribune columnist Michael Smolens, KPBS Environment Reporter Eric Anderson, and Sarah Libby, Managing Editor at Voice of San Diego. Just 2 years after voters rejected the idea, California Governor Gavin Newsom this week put an end to the death penalty, at least for now. Claiming legal authority and a moral responsibility, the governor, a Roman Catholic, gave a blanket reprieve to all condemned 737 prisoners in the state. And here's Newsom on why he's shutting down California's death row.
The question really is, do we have the right to kill? Do we have the right to kill? And that's a deep and existential question. I don't believe we do. You know, I know people think eye for eye, but if you rape, we don't rape. And I think if someone kills, we don't kill. We're better than that.
All right, and Matt, start with the legal issue. Newsom has the power to do this as he claims?
We'll find out, is the short answer. He definitely has the authority to issue the moratorium. 2 other steps he took: to close the execution chamber at San Quentin and to withdraw the lethal injection protocol. We'll see. So I think that there may be some lawsuits filed. But the question is, he's already said he's not going to kill anyone when he's in office. Could be 7 years, right? At least 3. Do you want to start that legal process knowing he's already made his position?
Right, so we'll see what happens, maybe lawsuits, and we'll see how that plays out. And the reasons, we saw some of his reasons there, but there's a wide range of reasons that Newsom and other people who advocate against the death penalty have, right?
Yeah, his big 3 were that people of color are inequitably harmed by this. I think 6 out of 10, or more than 6 out of 10 of the people on death row are people of color. The cost issue is a big one. And then also, as the Innocence Project has shown us locally, the question of whether people are sentenced to death and are innocent, as several hundred have been and been released in recent years. Right,
not necessarily all from death row, but DNA has cleared a number of them in some cases, notably in San Diego. The reaction to the governor's declaration here, the people who want to keep the death penalty in place, obviously were not happy. Yeah,
it's all over the map. I mean, this is an emotional, complex, pretty nuanced issue, and so I think you have people who are opposed to the death penalty having one point of view, people who support it having another. You see a lot of prosecutors, DAs up and down the state who are opposed to his action, coming forward very strongly and saying that they're hearing from families of victims that this move won't hold. And the interesting thing here is that I think the quote that you played, he talked more about the death penalty this week than he did during his campaign. It didn't come up as an issue because of the vote in 2016. When he was asked about it, his answer was, "I'll uphold the will of the public." Clearly, he's not doing that now. So that is also one kind of avenue where critics can leverage some arguments.
Hasn't there been this sort of moratorium in effect? Yeah. In essence, California hasn't killed anyone
12
in
years
death row since 2006, right? So what really, I guess the question I have for you is, what changed from that time period to now? I mean, obviously, clearly now we're not going to, but we didn't do it for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why we stopped in 2006 is that courts declared it unconstitutional. The state at the time was using a 3-drug kind of cocktail, and they had taken steps to say, here's our policy, we're going to have a new way of doing it. And so it became a greater reality for him. At some point, he was going to have to, here's our protocol. The next step is executions. And I think it's 25 people who have exhausted all their appeals, who are on death row. So you're talking about, 24 people whose lives are literally in his hands.
Right. Michael, I wanted to get to the politics of this, and Matt touched on that. Not really, it seems to be a heartfelt move, something he sincerely believes. He's not really having an eye on political gain here.
It is heartfelt and very personal. And, you know, some people think of Gavin Newsom as a very slick politician, which he is, but he comes off as very genuine. And in this case particular, it is personal because, you know, he would hold the lives of these people in his hands now. But also it goes back to his father was a judge, and he talked about having years of discussions with him about the death penalty. So it is very personal. But sure, he has an eye on the politics. Would that have changed if he saw the politics negative? Probably not, given how emotional this was for him. But even though the death penalty was supported by Californians in that recent election, I think recent polls show that still holds. Is that going to hurt him politically? Because clearly he was supported and got votes from people that supported the death penalty. Unless they're absolutely one-issue people, they probably didn't vote for him to begin with. So are they going to abandon him over this when the state hasn't, you know, put anybody to death since '06? So in that regard, but I think it's short-sighted for any politician not to look at the politics, whether that guides them or not, but not for themselves, but for their party, for the state's health as well. So I'm sure they looked at it.
And Democrats are backing him. His own party is backing him so far.
Yeah, I mean, the Democratic caucus in the legislature is among the more liberal components of the Democratic Party. So certainly there are moderates, but I think that he's got strong support there.
And one other political aspect, Senator Kamala Harris, of course, is running for president, has her own history with this issue here, but she came out immediately and supported Governor Newsom on this.
Well, what he did in doing this is really put this back on the national map. She immediately made it an issue and probably a litmus test for a lot of Democratic presidential candidates. And of course, the Democratic primaries tend to lean more liberal as the Republican primaries lean more conservative. So that's going to be an issue. And, you know, Newsom is kind of carrying the message to the country. I think it was this morning he was on The View where he talked about it, and he got cheered pretty heavily for his stances and so forth. So he's kind of pushing this nationally.
Yeah. And Matt, we talked a little bit about what happens now, but it's a moratorium. I mean, assuming if he has 2 years, it's not going to happen on his watch, and that's the whole point. Do you crank it back up after all those years? As we noted, it was 12 or 13 years since the last execution. By then, it'll be 20 years.
Yeah, I think the three things to keep in mind are, one, as long as he's governor, there's not going to be any executions in California, full stop. And then we will see some more lawsuits, inevitably, and maybe a ballot measure in 2020. You talked about the Democrats' kind of power in California. To get a ballot measure through, all you need is 2/3 support in the two chambers, and Democrats have that, so they could easily push something forward. Whether it would get a simple majority vote in 2020, whether there would be a competing ballot measure, I mean, calling it a simple majority isn't a simple issue, right. So we'll see what happens.
All right, all sorts of things to watch on that. Well, it was a very bold move this week. We're going to move on. Well, millions paid in bribes, dozens of rich and sometimes famous parents arrested and charged. Elite universities, Yale, Georgetown, Stanford, UCLA, USC, and the University of San Diego included, tarnished by an admissions scandal. And students are earned their way in, saying they're not surprised that rich people cheat to get their kids into top colleges. So, Michael, let's start with the intriguing figure at the middle of all of this guy from Newport Beach.
Well, William Rick Singer is the guy, and he purportedly ran a college preparatory company. There are lots of those around, and also had this sort of educational foundation. And that's, it was all really a scam. Now, it's not to say there weren't legitimate, parents that bought the services and were helped in legitimate ways, but clearly many students and parents, were involved in this whole like I said, scam.
And he got millions for this. He made a lot of money over time. Finally, they caught up with him, and then he started cooperating with the feds who wore a wire. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that's about all I know that's been reported. But I mean, it was an intriguing two-step process. They were able to cheat on tests and bribe coaches and officials. The test was sort of the cheaper option. It seemed like it was tens of thousands of dollars to $75,000. And what they had this, I think his name was Mark Rydell, the very apparently brilliant Harvard grad who basically helped either the kids out with their tests or would have access to tweak the answers to help them out afterwards. Maybe the students didn't know. And or sometimes take the test entirely. So that was kind of one route, and the other route was through the side door, as Singer, I guess, said, that they would bribe coaches and administrators and give these students the give the impression that these students were athletes, and in most cases they weren't. Tennis players, soccer players, water polo players, and track and field. And so it's pretty intriguing that all of this was just untrue, but yet it got people in.
Not college athlete, hadn't even played the sport in
some
many
cases,
instances.
Yeah.
So 2 notable San Diegans charged and arrested in this scandal.
Yeah, I have to refer to my notes to so many moving parts, but it's, Elizabeth Kimmel and Todd McFarlane. Elizabeth Kimmel is
Toby McFarlane, right?
Toby, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
That's right.
She once owned KPBS, the television station.
KFMB.
Yeah, I'm on KPBS.
There you go. Right, that's all right.
Thank you.
There are a lot of names, a lot of moving parts. Absolutely. KFMB, right? Broadcasting, right?
Thank you for the correction. And they each had 2 children that they in this case paid bribes to get into to various schools. I think her 2 kids, one got into Georgetown, who has since graduated, another into USC, and I think both his children were got into USC via soccer and basketball. The basketball one's sort of intriguing. His son apparently is 5'5", but they put down that he was 6'1", and he played, I think, 1 year of high school basketball player. They never played the sports in college. The son of Kimmel was very interesting because he was, alleged to be a pole vaulter, which he wasn't. In addition to everything else and all the other lies on the admission or in seeking admission, they provided a photograph that wasn't of him. It was of a Texas high school pole vaulting champion. So this guy just saw it in the media and was aghast.
Yeah, very clever in some of the regards here. Matt, the response from USD, and I think they're saying that this was a former coach and they're cooperating and all.
Yeah, I think USD is cooperating with the investigation, and to date it seems like there are individuals involved, but the institution, is not really at risk. Although I will note that USD, while all the other universities implicated in this scandal were listed as highly selective universities in the complaint, USD was called selective. Right. So sorry, USD students.
A little slight there.
But, look, this thing, as we editorialized the other day, it's interesting because rich folks have been getting away with stuff in one form, fashion, or another for forever.
That's a question that kind of popped up in my head very early on when this story broke. Was how is this different from a rich alum donating $12 million to build a building and then have his grandchildren admitted to the school as a legacy admission? How is that different?
Well, I think Michael summed it up.
That's legal graft as opposed to this. I mean, yeah, is it fair? I mean, look, this has been going on since the beginning of the country. All the big, great Eastern institutions were very exclusive, and kids of important people got in. Things have gotten better to certain degrees. What was really interesting, as you mentioned, we're not surprised. I think it was NPR interviewed a lot of students around the country, particularly in the New England area, and those who got in legitimately said, they're not. What surprised them is that people got caught. They knew this was going on. They knew they had the upper hand. And what I think really boiled the blood of some students, particularly underprivileged and minorities, that for a long time they've been looked at. Oh, you got in because of that. You've got a break and so forth. And we all know that. Look, even in a legitimate way, rich folks have the ability to pay for tutors, pay for these prep courses that are expensive.
To live in neighborhoods that have wonderful schools with counselors who can facilitate these kinds of admissions. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely.
Pay for sports teams and travel teams and a lot of the stuff that's so expensive that's out of the reach of so many families. Now, there's been a couple lawsuits filed already, and a couple of students, and they're claiming damages. Are they going to go anywhere?
Well, I think in the latest stories I've read, the legal experts say probably not. One of the lawsuits is seeking refunds, and one lawyer said maybe there's a case there. That would open up a pretty big door, but that wouldn't be as much as I think a woman that used to teach in Oakland filed a $500 billion lawsuit claiming her son was denied. There was another one for $5 billion. I don't think those are going to go anywhere unless unless they prove that the schools, that it was a systematic thing with the schools rather than these corrupt people, which is what the schools are saying now, that they're victims as well.
And USC says they're already going to give you your $85 back for the admission fee.
And the schools are not being seen as part of this conspiracy. They're seen as the victims?
Individual administrators, I think, at this point. I know as a USC alum, I got a communication from the president that called USC a victim in all of this, and I already saw a lot of pushback to that kind of framing.
Well, Sarah, as an alum, this isn't the only scandal that's cooking up there.
No, I think the silver lining in all of this, if you're a USC alum, is just that you've been so hardened to scandal over the years. You know, I went to school with Reggie Bush, and it's just been one thing after another.
And there's other schools, misery and company on this one. Well, we'll watch this as it goes. I'm sure we haven't heard the last of this scandal. We are going to move on. Well, it's California's largest lake and inland refuge for shorebirds, but the Salton Sea in the desert east of San Diego is in trouble, and birds there are dying. And Eric, start right there. What caused this big bird die-off in January? It was a lot of birds, right?
Yeah, it was a lot of birds. About 7,000 birds that contracted avian cholera. And avian cholera is a very communicable disease. It's not uncommon at lakes in the West, particularly in the winter. What happens is birds huddle together. They're in close proximity to one another. One of them gets sick. They quickly pass it on. It spreads pretty quickly and goes through that cycle. So that's not really what's unusual, but it's sort of a symptom of what's happening. The reason that the birds were huddled all together this past winter was because they were huddled around the freshwater inlets at the sea. That's where the remaining fish are. These are fish-eating birds. The fish in the majority of the sea are gone. It's too salty now for tilapia to survive out there. And so these birds were all huddled together, and it's kind of a signal that, you know, the health of the ecosystem there is not what it could be. Let's put it that way. I don't think it's a dying sea. I think it's a changing sea, and we're in the process of that change. Think of it as a big, huge bathtub, right? It's a 35-mile long, 12-mile wide bathtub, and somebody's kind of like nudged the stopper at the bottom of that tub, just enough to break the seal, so water's leaking out slowly, and not enough water's coming in fast enough to keep it at its current level. So it's receding. It's getting down and getting saltier.
It's kind of a fluke. It's there anyway, right? In the early 1900s.
Yeah, it was an accident.
Kind of was a sump in a big wet year, and all of a sudden this lake appeared.
Sure, it was a big accident. The Colorado River aqueduct broke, and it took them a year to fix that aqueduct levee, and by that time the sea had kind of filled up, and then they kept it there.
And of course we have a major agricultural area in the Imperial Valley. A lot of that fertilizer and minerals used in those crops gets into that sea.
Gets into the sea. There's toxic runoff that comes up the New River from Mexicali. That's an issue. And as the sea shrinks, what's happening on the ground is that the shoreline is being exposed. It's a very shallow lake. So if you lose a foot of depth in the lake, you know, the shoreline recedes several thousand feet. So you have all the shoreline exposed now, and it's fine dust. And when the wind blows out there, it picks that dust up. And there are people that live in that valley, and they're at increased risk of asthma. They're at increased risk of any kind of disease related to the respiratory system, because that dust is dangerous in and of itself, and it may be carrying those extra materials.
And the state has got a plan. They've been for a while now trying to mitigate this effect, right?
Well, yes. They agreed 15 years ago with the signing of the quantification settlement agreement, the water sharing deal of the Colorado, that they would do it. They only really got around to it about a little bit over a year ago, and they haven't fully funded it. It only has about half the funding needed for the first 10 years. And, you know, the first 10 years, the idea is to flood areas that have been exposed.
Knock down
shallow
that
water,
dust,
right?
yeah.
Build a berm, flood it, keep the dust inside, create some habitat for birds. But that 10-year plan only calls for flooding about half of the playa that's going to be exposed. So it's not really adequate, and the part that they do have funded is only funded about halfway.
So don't have a lot of time left, but is the Salton Sea sustainable over time, and is it worth the money and the efforts to try and fix it? We got a lot of wildlife involved.
That's a big question for such a short amount of time. Sustainable over time, I'm not sure that's the right way to phrase the question, but I think it needs to be managed, right? Because the public health risk is very real. And you have to consider that the dust threat is not only a threat to the people who live in the Imperial Valley, it's also a threat to the people who live north of the lake and into the LA basin, because winds can carry all those materials up into Los Angeles. So there are millions of people who are at a higher risk of health problems if the Salton Sea isn't managed by the state.
Okay, well, another ongoing story that we'll keep an eye on there. It's a sad situation right now. Well, we're going to move on. Score a win this week for the public's right to know what powerful government leaders are up to. A bill to weaken the state's Public Records Act was withdrawn. And Sarah, start with that. Who was behind this bill and what would it have done?
So it was carried in Sacramento by Senator Ben Hueso, but it was primarily crafted by Mara Elliott, the city attorney in San Diego.
So 2 San Diegans behind
this.
Yes,
2 San Diego Democrats. And it would have instituted some hurdles when it comes to suing a public agency that you believe isn't complying with the Public Records Act. And right now, suing an agency is essentially the only recourse somebody has if they feel like they're not getting the records that they ask for. There's no administrative agency that can weigh in. There are no fees if an agency doesn't comply. So this would have made it harder to sue, and it also would have made it harder to recoup your attorney's fees if you won the case. And again, that's really the only financial incentive right now that an agency has to comply with the law.
So it really would have gutted things for the media and the public trying to get a hold of these records.
It would have made it much harder, yes.
Okay, and Mara Elliott, the city attorney, what was her comment on this push to restrict access and that it died prematurely?
So she has essentially said that, you know, cities and agencies are burdened by influxes of requests, that it takes time and money, and so she said that she was trying to, you know, juggle all of those concerns.
Okay. Matt, I want to turn to you because the UT editorial called the death of the Hueso-Elliott bill a triumph for transparency. What was your argument there?
I think Sarah explained it very, very well. I mean, the day that the Voice story emerged about this bill was the day that we did our editorial, our first editorial, saying this is a travesty. I mean, it's an atrocity of a bill, and it was surprising, frankly, that it came from a city attorney. And so why it's a triumph for transparency is because, A, the San Diego City Council unanimously, Democrats and Republicans alike, and a Republican mayor, all took a stand against this bill, which shows me that there are at least, maybe they're doing it for political reasons, maybe they're doing it for good government reasons, but they're taking a stand for open government. And the fact that this bill was pulled so quickly shows me that Hueso and Elliott kind of came to their senses, although I do think this will hang around their necks like an albatross. I mean, they're going to be forever known, haunted really by the fact that they thought this was a good idea.
Yeah, Michael, what about the politics here?
Well,
were they just tone deaf?
I was going to ask Matt that you know, there was the unanimous council opposed the bill in the mayor's office. It came after a lot of outcry, your reporting, the editorials. Do you think that they might have kind of held off to see, I mean,
see which way the wind was
that their
blowing?
initial instinct, or the overwhelming trend was that we better get out against this?
The whole thing is weird, and I haven't talked to Senator Hueso
because it didn't happen immediately.
Right, it was about 2 weeks, would you say, that it was
yeah,
from
definitely,
introduction to
I think the backlash caught them off guard.
Yeah.
Maybe they were anticipating there are thousands of bills in the legislature that this would maybe skate by, or that people would just simply take their claims that it would make the process better at face value. But clearly that's not what happened.
Well, and also it has to be, you know, people that know the process. I mean, a lot of even journalists that just don't deal with public records sort of like, it
takes resources to file these types of cases and to pursue public records in court. So it's really, you know, you need to have a knowledge of the process to know that this would have made it much harder.
Exactly.
So we talked recently on the show about the new Police Transparency Act and how that's been fought by some police unions and some folks here, and, you know, 6-figure bills for record requests here in San Diego from the sheriff who finally backed down. But is there, to play devil's advocate for a minute, is there credence to the argument that agencies can get flooded with document requests, that this really is onerous in terms of cost and staff time?
Well, I think there are two important things to consider there. One is that many agencies employ lots of communications staffers and legal specialists whose job is to deal with these requests. And so I think the framing that this is taking away from their duties or a burden is kind of misguided, because it is the crux of their duty to do that type of work. And I also think one thing that's important to consider is that public records often save agencies money. You know, they can point out waste, they can point out corruption and fraud and all kinds of things that it takes being out in the open in order to deal with and correct. And so the idea that it costs them money and is a burden, I think, is misguided, because this can really save agencies a lot of money by, you know, shining some light on some of big problems.
Right. Eric?
Is it typical for legislation like this to be coming from a city attorney? That seemed odd to me as a casual observer.
It is something that she has the right and ability to do. I can't recall an instance in which she in particular has sponsored a bill. She's certainly weighed in on other bills that would impact her work. But this was the first time that I know of that she specifically, wrote a bill.
All right, just a few seconds left. Your job isn't really made easier by this. Now it's just back to what it was.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see improvements to the Public Records Act, and at this point, this was just beating back something that would have made it worse.
Yeah, hurdles that were almost insurmountable. Well, good. Well, we'll see what happens, and stay out there and keep digging for those records. It's what we're all relying on. Well, we are out of time. That wraps up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable, and I'd like to thank my guests, Matt Hall of the San Diego Union Tribune, Michael Smolens, also of the Union Tribune, Eric Anderson of KPBS News, and Sarah Libby of Voice of San Diego. And a reminder, you can look at all the stories that we discussed today. They're available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today, and join us again next Friday on the Roundtable.